In this lecture, we're going to talk about visualization for deep learning. As a first paper about visualization, I recommend this article on distill.pub. This article has not only stunning visuals, it also has really nice figures, and there are links to Colab notebooks for you to try out things yourself. One way to visualize neural networks is to create very fancy 3D animations. For example, there's a really nice 3D visualization by Denis Dmitriev that looks really great. However, it's hard to see what's going on. Still, I recommend looking at this. It's only a few minutes, and I will link the video. It's linked in these slides, but I'll also add it to the playlist. One thing to consider is that there's this problem of tone mapping or range mapping whenever visualizing tensors of arbitrary values. So if we look at one particular tensor that is being output by a network at a particular layer, there will be values that range from some minimum min to some maximum max. And this minimum and maximum is very unlikely to align with the values that the computer can display if they're handed over as an image. So we assume that the visible range that a monitor can display is from minimum 0 to maximum 1. So the problem of tone mapping and range mapping is to take a tensor image of arbitrary values and map the values to the range from 0 to 1 somehow. And there are very complicated methods to do so, but for visualization, especially visualizing neural networks, people pick some of the very simple ones. So one example would be to map the minimum to 0 and the maximum to 1. So for example, you want to visualize one channel as a grayscale image, you can map the minimum to 0 and the maximum to 1. Also, what you could do is find some form of clamping. You could simply say that, okay, everything that's smaller to 0, you clamp to 0, and everything that's bigger than 1, you clamp to 1. So the warning is that the results can look very different when the range mapping changes. So let's say the values are in a small range from -epsilon to +epsilon, but the values are mapped to the complete visible range from 0 to 1. Then even very small differences, they will be largely amplified because the complete visible range is used, and in reality, maybe all these values are just really some random noise, and all of the values are really very insignificant. But by mapping to the complete visible range, you would think that all the values are used, and maybe the variability between the values is really large. Maybe for another tensor or channel, the values range from -100 to 100, let's say, but they're also mapped inside the visible range. And then this range mapping might hide that maybe for some of the channels you have, there will be really a small range, and for other channels, there will be a really large range. And so this is a channel concept that doesn't only concern the channels of a tensor, but any type of image, grayscale image. And so the people pick different types of range mapping in their visualizations, and that makes it always a bit difficult to understand what exactly is going on. Sometimes people compute range mapping for one particular image. Sometimes they visualize a collection of images and have one fixed range mapping where they maybe do a mixture between compressing the range and clamping, but I'll just leave that as a general warning. The first idea we're going to discuss is visualizing filters directly as RGB images. And this works great for filters with the size width times height times 3. That means that the filters that operate on 3 channels. And this is typically possible for the first convolutional filters. So that means the filters of the first conv layer. This does not work great for small filters that have a kernel size maybe 3 times 3. That means spatial size of 3 times 3, because then they're so small. And it does not work great for filters in later layers because, for example, there could be many channels. So let's say there would be a filter of size 3 times 3 times 5, 12. Then you cannot easily visualize that as RGB image. So here are some examples from different networks, and the larger the filter size, the better for us. So AlexNet is the best because there are filters that have spatial size 11 times 11 times 3 for red, green, blue channel, and then 64 means that there are 64 such filters. So what you see here is that there are 64 images. One image corresponds to one filter. Then ResNet 18 still works because there's a 7 times 7 filter, or ResNet 101 or DensNet 121 with initial 7 times 7 filters. That also still works. What is interesting to see is that there are some similarities between these filters. So what one can observe are these type of edge detecting filters that look a bit like Gabor filters. Maybe something like this, or something like this, something like this. And these could be seen, at least to some degree. You see these type of patterns repeating in all the networks that are displayed here. Maybe we can also highlight a filter like this, looks like some checkerboard filter, and we could also see something like that at DensNet 121 over here. Maybe something like this. All right. Other filters look for color edges. Maybe we look at this green, purple edge, or this blue-red edge over here. So maybe DensNet, let's look at this. I mean, this looks at a different orientation, but this is still maybe a color edge. This is also some color edge over here. Our next idea, if the number of input channels increases, is to visualize filters as a collection of grayscale images. We have an input of, that means, or we have filters of size width times height times Cin, where Cin is the number of channels of the input tensor to a particular layer. And we assume that Cin is greater than 3, so the red, green, blue image direct visualization doesn't really work. So now we can just take this and visualize it as Cin separate grayscale images. So one particular filter will consist of Cin grayscale images, and we have Cout filters. Therefore, this will result in Cout times Cin grayscale images. Later on in the network, if we go from 512 channels to 512 channels, you can imagine that this will be a very large number. So what we see here are 20 groups of 16 grayscale images each. Each grayscale image is one channel of one filter. So these grayscale images here belong to one filter. That means the second channel of the input tensor will be convolved with this here, and the last channel of the input tensor will be convolved with this here. So now we could try to find similarities between these grayscale images. For example, we look at this grayscale image here, and we could ask if any of these other filters within this group look similar. So for me, this is too hard to tell. Also, we could look at patterns such as edges or maybe a checkerboard pattern like before. But again, at least to me, it is too difficult to really easily see patterns in this data. But we can also visualize the activation tensors. So a particular layer might output one tensor, and we can try to show each channel of such a tensor as a grayscale image. So a width times height times C tensor would give C grayscale images where C is the number of channels, and the size of each image would be width times height. And width times height here is typically much larger than width times height of a filter. So visualizing activation tensors as grayscale images might work out better. What we see here is an input image of a person on the top left, and then in columns, I assume we see different layers. So here's conf1, and here would be conf3 layer. And then going down in the column, I assume we see different channels of an activation tensor. Highlighted here is one particular channel, and it's also, I think this is a increased version of this particular channel. And so the example here conjectures that this might be something that detects a face in an image, or that is a channel that reacts to a face in an image. For this particular visualization toolbox, there's also a short video highlighting some of the visualizations, and I also recommend that you look at it. It's just a few minutes, and I will also link the description in the playlist for the course. Another idea is to visualize maximally activating patches. Again, we're going to pick one particular layer in the network, let's say layer number 8, and then we're going to pick one particular channel, let's say channel number 27. And so for this channel, we might say, okay, let's go through the complete training data set, and let's pick the k images, let's say k equals 9, that produce the maximal response in this channel. So there are variations where you could just say the maximal response anywhere in this channel, or the maximal response at one particular pixel within this channel, within this layer. But let's just assume we'll pick the maximum response anywhere in the channel. So in this example, conf5 of AlexNet is 13 times 13 times 128. So we could pick any of the 128 channels and then look for the maximum activation. So we could run many, or let's say even all 1 million plus ImageNet images through the network, and then we find the k largest ones. That means the k images corresponding to the largest activations. But then we're not only interested in the images, but really in the patches that are kind of centered around the location where this large activation happens. So then we would have to crop the patches from the input images such that the crop corresponds to the receptive field of this largest value. Here are some examples. So in each row, we see a different channel that is being picked. And so maybe a conjecture would be that the first row that is corresponding to one channel is looking for something that looks like either a dog eye or a dog snout, or maybe just some circular pattern on white background. The fourth row seems to correspond to some text, as well as the last row seems to correspond to some text, and the second to last row seems to correspond again to some circular pattern. But it is not really easy to give a semantic interpretation for all these examples. But these are examples for trying to pick maximal activations for earlier layers in the network. If we go to later layers, we will see that these activations tend to correspond to more semantically meaningful concepts. So here, for example, we see that the first row picks out sometimes parts of cars plus some other things, and the second row, it really seems to pick out faces or humans, part of humans maybe. The fourth row is looking for dog faces, and again the last row is looking for something that is difficult to interpret. There's a flower, a dog, a man with a hat, and something that looks like a cattle. One general problem, though, is that the network will not only have high activation to these image patches, but there will also be high activations when someone feeds in something that looks completely different from the training set. So there could be some nonsensically looking noise image that also creates very high activations, and not only, let's say, maybe faces. This problem will be something that is a major motivation for a lot of the later work that we will discuss. So what people tried to do was try to find an image by optimization that creates a particularly high activation or a particularly high activation in one given channel. And then the question is, how can we avoid that this image just looks like nonsense? But for now, let's look at this idea embedding images into 2D. The data processed by the network, some activation tensor, can be seen as features. So we can pick a layer, typically a late layer into the network, and we can say that this tensor in a late layer, often a vector, is just a feature encoding for an image. And so now we would like to embed the input images in 2D somehow and hope that similar input images are close by. So let's say we're going to pick one of the fully convolutional layers that creates a 4096 dimensional vector as output, and then we use dimension reduction to map these D dimensions, 4096 dimensions, to 2 dimensions. So we locate all the features in the Euclidean plane. Something you might have heard about or should have heard about if you took a machine learning class or linear algebra class is PCA, but there are more complicated versions. One popular, at least for a long time, the most popular algorithm was T-SNE. We're not going to go into details of these algorithms, but just show some result. So this is an example visualization where each dot corresponds to one input image of the MNIST dataset, where the MNIST dataset depicts images of numbers from 0 to 9. And these input images are color-coded such that each number corresponds to one particular color. So we can see that what the network does is it nicely separates the images of different numbers, and in feature space you can then nicely cluster these different images corresponding to different numbers. But what we don't see here is how do these images actually look like. So another type of visualization tries to do something similar, but instead of displaying images by dots, people try to display images by a low-resolution version of the input image. And what can be done then, or has to be done then, is the images have to be moved slightly so that they fit into a regular grid. So this is 2D embedding, this dimension reduction is giving maybe some initial location, and then images have to be moved a bit such that they fit into a grid and that there's no overlap. So here's an example from Stanford, from Andrei Karpathy, and we're going to look at some of these examples. Let's maybe pick this one right here. So here the images are a bit too small to see something, so let's try to zoom in so we can see here's a lot of blue. Let's try to zoom in here, and what we can see is this looks like something. There are rockets and towers right here. Maybe here there's some buildings, and up here we see something like I don't know, tractors, some type of farm equipment. Let's also look in this green part down here, and here we see some bugs. Let's just leave it at that. We see some flowers over here, and I guess we have some scorpions in this area right here. Another idea is to visualize nearest neighbors in feature space. For example, in a network, we can take the output of a really late layer in the network, for example for AlexNet or VGG, a late convolutional or late fully connected layer, and then we can use the tensor or the vector that is output by a given layer as a feature descriptor for an image, and then we can search for similar images in the dataset using a simple distance metric, for example, the L2 metric. What we see here is a query image given in the first column, and then the next 6 images are the found results in the dataset that are closest to the query image. In the first row, we see that the algorithm, which is a very simple basically nearest neighbor or k nearest neighbor search, did a really good job in finding 6 similar flowers to the given flower. In the second row, we also see that this feature embedding shows a really good understanding of an elephant. The images that are retrieved not only have elephants to the left of the image, at the left border, such as shown in the input query image, but they can also find an elephant if it is on the right border. The input elephant looks rather young, and this elephant looks a lot bigger, and also it has visible tusks which are not really visible in the input image. Also this and this example, they seem to have really good results just doing nearest neighbor search. This visualization idea is to create saliency maps via occlusion. We'll just show the idea using an example. Given an input image, one can use a rectangle or a square to mask out pixel values. So the values that are inside the square will set to one particular value, let's just say to the average pixel value. So this average pixel value will be some sort of a gray value, as shown here. This square, now this will have some center, let's say here. And what we're going to do is we'll take this degenerated image that has this square cut out, send it through the network, and we will record the probability of the class. That means the probability of the correct class. And then the probability will be associated with this center pixel, let's say. And then what we do is we repeat this experiment by shifting the square over the whole image, let's say 1 pixel at a time, and then we always record how the class probability changes. So the intuition is that when we cut out a square, such as this square here to the left, then the class probability of elephant shouldn't change much, and the class probability should still be high. But if we are occluding the most important part, so this is just a human guess of what the most important part of the elephant would be, that is the face of the elephant, then we would expect that the class probability would drop the most. So here we see some results for a schooner, which is some sort of boat example, and looking at the legend here, we see that white has the highest probability, and then going to black, the probability is the lowest. Still not very low, so it's like 0.88, but nevertheless, the intuition still is that the more salient pixels are the ones that are most important, and then if we say maybe this is the lowest probability here in the middle, that means if we cut out a square in the middle of this image, in the middle of the boat, then the algorithm becomes less certain about the result. So for the go-kart track, what we see is this is a bit split, the distribution. So one thing that's intuitive is that if we are actually taking this part right here, that seems to correspond to masking out this first card here. But then in the background, if we look at something like this area here, it's not really clear why masking out this part here would have a big influence, but maybe to recognize this go-kart is as important to look at the go-kart itself as it is to see kind of hints that there's some go-kart track. Saliency via gradients is another idea. We could ask what pixels in the input image should change to improve the class score. To do this, we're going to compute a forward pass to compute the class score of the input image, and then we'll do a backward pass. So we are computing the gradient of the class score with respect to the image pixels. And then we will obtain a gradient value for each pixel in the image. And then what we are going to do is we're going to take the absolute value of the gradient, and we're going to look at the maximum values among these absolute values. And maybe the smaller gradient values will set to 0. So here's an example. There's the input image, in this case the dog, it's going through the network. Then we get the dog as the class answer, and then we'll compute the gradient with respect to the pixels in the input image, and then we'll take the absolute value of the gradient, and we will take the maximum values, and then we get the result shown on the right, bottom right here. And this is also intuitive, as the values with the pixels with a high gradient are the ones that are around and on the dog. Some various other examples, but still a bit difficult to interpret. Let's say we have this monkey here, then this visualization here really seems to correspond to the pixels covered by the monkey. Some other animal here, and again the salient pixels seem to do a pretty good job. Tower, same thing, and also marine animals. There's some rays. You can see this ray seems to correspond to this here, and then this one here maybe it becomes a bit more tricky to say what exactly this corresponds to. Or also, if you're honest, if you look at this visualization here, just looking at this, it's kind of difficult to say really what this saliency map semantically depicts. Now we go back to the idea that we briefly mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, that is visualization using optimization. So the general idea is we want to use optimization to increase, maximize a particular network response. So for example, we could use gradient ascent. So this is an iterative algorithm. Let's say we will initialize an image at step 0 with white noise. And then we will iteratively change the image such that the image that we optimize for maximizes a particular network response. So this is step 2048, and here we already get a really nice and colorful image. And now we will discuss several ideas related to this general framework. And so the goal is we would like to obtain an image that on the one hand really maximizes a particular response, but on the other hand is somewhat similar to a natural image. And this is kind of open to debate. What does it mean to be similar to a natural image? So what we don't want is something that looks very similar to this step 0, basically just some very chaotic noise pattern that you cannot understand. So for example, this one thing that you see here in the slide, it doesn't look like an object that you know in real life, but it somewhat looks like a pattern, at least, that seems to look like a natural image. And so what the ideas is, or what different authors proposed, are different ideas to put a regularizer on this optimization to ensure that the image looks interpretable. But then it's always a trade-off, right? If you put a very strong regularizer, then the visualization might not show what the network actually does. It might show what the regularizer forces the image to look like. So this is kind of a very tricky part of the visualization. The visualization then is a compromise between what the network really does and what the regularizer told the visualization to show. All right, nevertheless, let's go into different design choices, how people set up these algorithms. First, what objective function, what kind of activation to maximize? So typically we go into one particular layer. We have an activation tensor that is output by this given layer, and then we look at this activation tensor. But what should we try to maximize here? Should we maximize, I'll call this single neuron, or let's better say a single value in this width times height times c activation tensor? We could say, let's look at pixel 3723 in channel number 15. Or are we looking for a complete channel or activation map? That is one complete channel in the activation tensor. Are we going to look at a complete activation tensor? This would be all values in a width times height times c activation tensor. at the end of the network, there will be the choice of looking class logits. These are raw class scores before the softmax activation function, or we could look at class probabilities. These are then really the probabilities after the softmax activation. So, and here are the visualizations. So what we see here, this is one particular pixel in one particular channel. This here in yellow, this is one selected channel in an activation tensor. Or do we really look at all values in an activation tensor? Do we look at the class logits or raw scores before the softmax, or the probabilities after the softmax? So if we look at one particular neuron, what we can see is that we kind of optimize for a localized response. So you will see that the pattern will be centered somewhere, but after some region of influence, we can see that on the boundary there will be less of a response. Trying to optimize for one particular channel, we will see visualizations that kind of expand over the whole image uniformly, such as here. Now, really trying to do something with all channels at once is more like some fancy visualization that maybe is a bit hard to interpret, but it's almost more like generating some artistic images. So there's this really famous initial work called DeepDream that does something like this. There's some argument that generally trying to go for class logits, such as in this example here, gives higher quality results than going for class probabilities, such as in this example here. We'll also discuss that shortly. Next choice, are we going to start from a random image, a zero image, or start from a given image? Next choice is basically the regularizer, and there will be many different options. But then, after we made our choices, in general the framework is we want to get this image that is a visualization of something in the network, where we kind of optimize something so the output is the image, and there will be this f of I, which is a function on tensor values computed by a forward pass of I through the network, and then we have this Ri, which is the regularizer that ensures that the visualization looks like a natural image, so whatever that means. So this is a short side remark on why class probabilities are less often used than raw class scores, at least as advertised by this one paper. The conjecture is that in order to maximize a given class probability, it's easier to reduce all the other raw class scores than to increase the raw desired scores before softmax. And so this then leads to these counterintuitive results. And the other thing is that softmax makes things harder to optimize in general. But why do we need a regularizer at all? Let's look at some results without regularizer. Sometimes we can get reasonable results when optimizing for a very long time. But often the results look completely random. We're going to show two examples, one with a lower learning rate and then a second example with a higher learning rate. The example on the bottom of this slide is the example with the lower learning rate. If you look at the visualization, after 2048 steps in the bottom right corner, it is very difficult to interpret what is going on here. Also, note that the optimization leads to this typical checkerboard artifact that also happens in other of these network inversion methods by optimization. Well, I would say we cannot really see a pattern here. Let's look at something with a high learning rate. Looks a bit better. So after 2048 steps, we can see more. But what exactly is it? Maybe some of you can try to take a guess what you're actually seeing here. I would still say it's very difficult to make sense of this. So where do these checkerboard artifacts come from? The problem seems to come from strided convolution and pooling layers, as if there is, for example, a max pooling layer, the gradient will only go back to where the max came from, or this strided convolution. There's like a dominant grid pattern where the gradient is larger than anywhere else. So what we see here is a gradient pattern generated by backpropagation. So the earlier layers, this is kind of the input, and then the network forward pass goes in this direction, the backward pass goes in this direction, and we see a visualization of the gradient. And then these orange things, these are layers where the resolution in the forward pass decreases. So it's one of these problematic layers. And then you go from mixed 5a to mixed 4e. You see here in this gradient map a very distinct checkerboard pattern. Then as you go here, 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 this checkerboard pattern largely disappears, but then you get to this other problematic layer, and again the resolution changes, and then in mixed 3b here we see this checkerboard pattern, again very strongly noticeable. Same thing when we look at this layer, it introduces a checkerboard pattern here, and in this layer there's another strong. One interesting concept that was introduced is the idea of guided backpropagation. Again, we pick some intermediate activation tensor, we pick a channel, and we pick a very high activation, and then we are doing a backpropagation through the network, computing the gradient with respect to the input image. But we are going to modify backpropagation by only looking at positive gradients at each value. In this example, we see a single channel tensor being passed through the network. In the forward pass example, this is a tensor that is passed through a ReLU, and the ReLU computes the maximum, as we know, of 0 and the value. That means all values smaller than 0 will be clamped to 0. So for example, this -7 value will become a 0. All the positive values are passed through the ReLU, and they do not change. So as we can see, this 5 here remains to be a 5. Now we look at the backward pass of the same layer. While in the forward pass there were just some random numbers made up to show in this initial tensor here, and then the output was computed, what we have now is just some random gradient values are made up here, and the output of the backward pass, shown to the left here, is computed. In order to compute the backward pass, we also need to look at the values in the forward pass. In particular, we need to check here in this tensor which of these values were negative. These are actually all the ones marked in red, and then the backward pass, it will mask out all the values that correspond to red grid cells. So as a result, we get what you see here on the left. Note that this does not correspond to the yellow grid cells, where the yellow grid cells are the cells where the gradient itself is negative. So the negative gradient can be passed through the ReLU, but it is only passed through wherever in the forward pass the input was not negative. So there are these two ideas to modify this backpropagation step. One is to really kill all the negative gradient values. So what we say is we take this input, and what we're going to do is we are just passing through all the gradients where the gradient is positive. Another modification, guided backpropagation, is to say we will kill all gradients that correspond to the red cells, and we kill all gradients that correspond to the yellow cells. So this is giving you a much sparser gradient pattern here, because all the gradients corresponding to red and yellow cells are killed. So only the 6 and the 3 remain. All the values here, this is killed, this is killed, this is killed, this is killed because it corresponds to a yellow cell, and then these were red cells, and also this was a red cell. So the only thing that remains is the 3 and the 6. So for one visualization we showed previously, we showed these corresponding ideas, and what one can see is this looks maybe a bit almost like a colorful edge detector. So the visualization is shown in the image on the right that one can obtain from this modified backpropagation algorithm. So here is an example on the top. This corresponded to later layers in the network, and again we can kind of see something that looks a bit like an edge detector, I would almost say. Or it actually even looks similar to the input itself. So one interesting note is that this original paper by Seiler and Fergus, they introduced several ideas in the deconvolutional networks, but then later on people actually mapped several of these ideas, not the one for the ReLU that I explained before, but several of the other ideas they mapped to regular gradient computation. So there is, I think, this one paper that explains the mapping from the paper of Seiler and Fergus to other well-established concepts. Overall, I would say the idea of guided backpropagation is mainly interesting as a historical side note. This is not the main way how visualizations are generated nowadays. For some time, people just played with these regularizers to generate nicer visualizations. The simplest regularizer is to put some L2 loss on the image. So let's say we just initialize this visualization image to zeros or random noise, and then we do the algorithm we discussed. We do a forward pass to compute the tensors and the loss functions. Then we backpropagate to get the gradients of the loss values with respect to the image, and then we make small changes to the image, and we repeat. And what we're going to optimize is this SCI. So let's say this is the score for class C before softmax. That means we can kind of try to say what, in this is a particular example. I mean, we could do other tensor values here, but in this example, we try to create a response. That means an image IVIS that looks like it would excite a particular class. It will get a high response for a particular class classification. And then here we put a regularizer that is the squared 2 norm of the image. So this should be the F norm. That means it's a pixel-wise squared norm. Now in the image, because we are talking about image in transform space, the pixel values can be negative or positive, and this to norm prevents the pixels to be either too large or too low. So it kind of moves the pixels more to some average pixel value. And here we see some example visualizations. Maybe let's look at the first one, dumbbell. Maybe you can see some weights to lift, cup. All right, looks a bit like a cup. And Dalmatian, you can see some typical patterns you would expect on a Dalmatian. But maybe this L2 regularizer by itself wasn't enough, so another variation was proposed that does even a bit better. So we stay with the same thing as before, but this regularizer we kind of hack into the algorithm by modifying the image between iterations. So what we're going to do is somewhat implicitly add this regularizer that neighboring pixels should not be too different from each other. So we're going to do that by blurring the image using Gaussian kernels. And we're only going to do that every few iterations to make it faster. In addition, we're going to clip pixels with small values to 0. And this will create empty regions rather than regions with small random patterns influencing the results. Finally, there was this last idea to compute the inner product of the gradient and the pixel, and then, or this inner product of absolute value of gradient and pixel, and then set the pixel to 0 if this value is smaller than the threshold. And this is a bit tricky what this does exactly, but again the idea is to clip pixels that do not contribute much to the result. Let's look at some visualizations. So here we have Hartebeest to the left and billiard table to the right. We can see that these visualizations start to look similar to prototypical examples of a particular class. Station wagon is to the left, looks a bit like a car, and black swan is to the right. This type of visualization can also be used to not only maximize responses for the raw class scores, but also for particular chosen layers. So, or channels. So what we see here is some optimization results for optimizing some selected activations in layer 5, layer 4, layer 3, and layer 2. So the idea would again be that in the higher layers we see the features being a bit larger and maybe more semantically meaningful, and in the lower layers that we would mainly see some lower level patterns. But in this example visualization, the results in layer 5 are also not that easy to semantically interpret. One other aspect people looked at is the problem of diversity. So there can be multiple clusters of images that maximize the objective function. So as some random example, let's just say that one particular channel later in the network would not only activate for one semantic class of images, but for multiple. So the goal would somehow be to have a visualization that is not maybe only dominated by the most important, of the different semantic concepts that an activation reacts to, but that all of them are somehow captured in the visualization. So we do this visualization of patches that maximally activate, let's say, a particular layer, and then what we can see is that we have some sort of a bridge. We have a mast of some sailboat. We have some dome here, another dome. Now there might be more domes than other structures, but maybe still the dominant semantic concept that this thing reacts to is the dome, but the secondary concept is some truss structures. This visualization also has some other ideas. That is, we can not only look at the maximum activation examples, we can also look at slightly positive activation examples. And then we could also ask, what's the opposite? It's kind of not really the opposite, but in some sense, maybe the opposite of what this activation is looking for. So we can have slightly negative activation examples, and we also can look at minimum activation examples. And then what we see here is not only an optimization that tries to maximize the activations as on the right, but we can also have one that minimizes the activations as shown on the left. But for this activation, what is this really looking for? Sky, grid patterns, domes? It's hard to say. So one way to do this diversity optimization is maybe to generate different results, but have a diversity term that makes sure that the different results are different from each other. For this, for example, we could again make use of the Gram matrix and saying that Gram matrix has to be different to what has been computed before to get different results. So a single optimization example is shown to the left, where we'll just optimize an input image to for a given activation to maximize a given activation. And then in the middle, there's the idea to have 4 different visualizations that maybe look at the diversity of examples, or that better visualize the diversity of examples that excite the given activation. So 1, 2, 3, 4. We can still argue a bit how different these are. In some sense, the shapes look characteristically similar, but looking at the thing to the way right, this looks a lot more than an animal than the other 3, for example. And then to the right, we see dataset examples that excite this particular activation. And again, we could say that this is these results are not all from the same semantic concept. So there are a few birds, but then there's a chain, there's a snake, there's some ornament. Don't really sure what that is. So this would also be an activation where it's not really clear what it's looking for. And then maybe the diversity optimization can help a bit better to visualize different examples of what this activation is looking for. Some more similar visualizations. Again, there are 4 visualizations shown. So on the left, there are 4 visualizations, and here again 4 different visualizations. And I guess in the bottom example here, we really see a diversity that is quite large because of the second and third example. They look very different from the last and the first example. Maybe a similar idea was picked up by this paper, multifaceted visualizations. And also they say that classes can be maybe recognized due to multiple different types of features. So if you look at the bottom right, there would be many different types of images that indicate a grocery store. That could be that you have a zoomed in version of some of the vegetables or fruits. You could have some image that shows many different vegetable or fruits being offered, or you could even have an image that just shows the outside of the store. Then without going into the exact details of this particular paper, if we look to the bottom left, there would be a visualization attempt that visualizes the different facets, that means the different concepts that go into exciting this grocery store neuron. And again here, just so some different visualizations. These are input images that would kind of correspond to a particular class. And so here we can see that with these strong regularizers, the output looks more and more like a prototypical example of an image that belongs to one particular class. As a last example, we'll look at DeepDream, which is a mixture between visualization and art. What we can do is we can amplify activations instead of just maximizing them. So again, let's look at this as just picking a layer L in the CNN, and we want to compute the output tensor of this layer L in a forward pass using the image, and then what we want is to amplify the activation, so amplify the values in the tensor. We want them to change proportionally to how big they are. So what we do is we set the gradient of the chosen layer equal to the activations. So when the activation is very large, the gradient will be very large. If it's very small, it will be very small. And then we compute the gradients for lower levels by simple backpropagation. And then we're going to update I. So the whole thing is somewhat similar to computing some argmax of trying to maximize the activation squared in a particular layer. So the code is quite simple, but there are going to be a few tricks. The image is going to be jittered, and I think this has a similar effect to blurring the image. There will be some L1 normalization of the gradients. There will be clipping of pixel values, and also there's multi-scale processing. So looking at the code here, what we can see is code for jittering the image, code for the normalization of the gradient, and code for clipping pixel values. The multi-scale processing is not shown here, but code for this is publicly available, and you can go and download it and play with it. So let's say we start with a given input image, not with random noise, and then we do this DeepDream optimization. Then we can generate images like this. This creates these mystical creatures with many eyes, and people even gave names to these particular creatures. What type of creatures appear depends on the dataset that the network was trained on. Maybe ImageNet has lots of dogs, which explains the appearance of many dog-like or animal-like creatures. But if we train on architecture, we will see these architecture type patterns, these big towers being built, and these regular architecture structures. All right, this concludes the lecture about visualization. There will be these short images that I will also put in the playlist that correspond to some of the links I discussed. And then I will also show a short video or create a short video about TensorBoard, which is a practical, popular visualization toolkit